Well, Kate and Matt, thanks very much. That's it from me. I'll be back in an hour's time from more news from Donington.
Vishala, thank you very much. The BBC has announced the creation of a new digital channel for Scotland that will include an hour-long evening news programme at 9 o'clock. The channel will broadcast from 7 in the evening until midnight and cost around £30 million a year. However, some people are disappointed that there won't be a separate 6 o'clock news for Scotland. Our Scotland correspondent Lorna Gordon reports.
Inform, educate and entertain. The BBC's mission. Increased devolution has provided challenges for the national broadcaster.
2.5 minutes to an hour.
Now, a new channel and a new news programme for Scotland.
I think Scotland deserves its own channel that reflects itself, its creativity, its culture, as well as its politics. And I wanted to move the game on. And in the end, my aim through all of this has been to think about the viewers in Scotland and what is best for them. And I think they want quality and they want choice.
Tonight on Timeline...
The new channel will broadcast shows like this one, currently shown on BBC Two in Scotland. But with a budget of £30 million a year, much of the 5 hours of programmes on offer every night will be new. There'll also be an integrated news hour at 9, with national and international news.
It's a huge opportunity for Scotland to assert itself to itself and more broadly across the UK, and for it to reflect on some of the other things beyond politics. I mean, Scotland has a really, really vibrant arts community, creative community, whatever, and I think there's a real opportunity now for those communities to be better reflected.
Most high profile, though, has been the debate around news. The BBC said the 6 o'clock news had performed strongly in Scotland in recent years, but some have long argued for a Scottish version. They say to better reflect devolved areas like health, education and criminal justice.
Obviously, I welcome new jobs and new investment in BBC Scotland. I am, however, disappointed that the BBC has decided not to go ahead with the separate Scottish 6 on BBC One, because I think that this is exactly the time for the launch of that new programme with all the political developments we know.
This change to the broadcasting landscape in Scotland is being described as the biggest single investment in broadcast content here for more than 20 years. Challenging, yes, but bold and ambitious too, and on air in a year and a half's time. Lorna Gordon, BBC News, Glasgow.
Diana, Princess of Wales, was a style icon, and now many of her dresses are about to go on display to the public. Some of her most recognisable and exquisite outfits have been brought together for a new exhibition, Diana, Her Fashion Story, in this, the 20th anniversary year of her death. Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell has been to Kensington Palace for a preview.
Her public image was in so many ways defined by the clothes that she wore. She was one of the world's most photographed women, and many of the world's top designers clamoured to dress her. The results were frequently eye-catching, dresses that have lingered in the memory. And now, 20 years after Diana's death, 25 of those dresses have been brought together for an exhibition at her former home, Kensington Palace. They chart the evolution of an initially quite demure teenager through to her emergence on the national and international stages, with, outwardly at least, much greater confidence in her choices of costume. So here are some of the famous dresses, the one that she wore to dance with John Travolta, and others that were part of her wardrobe in the 1990s.
By the time she's wearing this dress, she's very confident in her own sense of style. We're seeing a Diana who has risen above those seasonal changes in fashion, and she has a timeless elegance. She knows what suits her and she wears it well.
Few would disagree with that, and the exhibition organisers can be confident that the crowds will come from around the world to experience something of Diana's glamour. Interest in Diana remains considerable despite the passage of years, but one imagines that her family would hope that she will be remembered for much more than just the dresses she wore. So do the organisers feel comfortable about perpetuating the focus on Diana and her clothes?
I think that's a very good question, because Diana herself didn't like to be known as a clothes horse. However, she did understand the language of fashion very well, and she used clothes to help her do the job at hand. She was a very proud ambassadress for British fashion as Princess of Wales, but she also used clothes to help her do her job as a humanitarian and as a patron of the arts, and to focus the press attention on her charity work.
They were the essential props which helped this sometimes insecure young woman to face the world and win its admiration for her image of glamour and style. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News, at Kensington Palace.
Now, Doris Day approaches. Let's go to Thomas Schaffernacker, who has the latest on that storm.
Yes, you're very right, Simon. Doris is approaching and it will strike during the day. So let's see what's happening then over the next 24 hours or so. Well, basically, this ribbon of cloud here is very menacing on the satellite pictures. Now we're starting to see some of these clouds rotate here. That's a surefire sign that there's a powerful storm developing here. See this sort of wave, and this is what's going to be happening within the next 12 hours or so. And the problem is that this storm is intensifying just as it's slicing the UK in half. So this will be a pretty nasty one. There's a couple of things with this. There's snow and wind, so we'll take a look at those in detail. Here's a look at the weather through this evening. So this is the outer edge of Storm Doris. We've got the rain coming in, the winds will be freshening, then they'll become stronger and stronger, but the worst of the storm won't be until it actually starts impacting northwestern parts of England, Wales, and then eventually moving a little bit further east. So the first problem, number one, snow across southern and central parts of Scotland. This is through the course of tonight into tomorrow morning. The suburbs of Edinburgh, for example, and Glasgow, getting some snow up to these amounts through the southern uplands, so that's mostly the hills. Some of us across Scotland could well be waking up to scenes like this first thing. Then after the snow, that's when the storm really starts winding itself up, and that's where those severe gales start blasting through northwestern England, Liverpool Bay, northern Wales, through the North Midlands into East Anglia as well. So the real problem then through the morning to around towards lunchtime will be the wind, and we're going to see a swathe of a few hours of very powerful winds capable of causing damage and disruption from northern Wales, again, Liverpool Bay, Manchester, Nottingham, down into East Anglia as well. Then south of that, the winds are less strong, but still causing a problem, I think, all the way down towards the south coast. So certainly strong enough gusts to cause problems like these, high-sided vehicles, potential of overturning. Some of us might have some fences down. This was probably worst-case scenario, overtoppling, for example, of the chimneys, but that will be few and far between, hopefully. And then by the second half of the afternoon tomorrow, that storm starts to pull out into the North Sea, eventually affecting probably places like the Netherlands, and then finally the winds will calm down, and then Friday morning looks as though it's going to be the pickup operation with all the bits and pieces lying around after the storm, but a much, much better day. But look at that, some rain sweeping, and this time not really gales. So we've got, quite a rough 24 hours on the way. Take care.
This is BBC News. I'm Simon McCoy. The headlines at 4. The fiancé of the children's author Helen Bailey is found guilty of her murder, dumping her body in a cesspit in the hope of inheriting millions of pounds.
He's lied to his own family, he's lied to Helen Bailey's family, he's lied to the colleagues and friends of Helen Bailey. A very wicked crime, one of the hardest and most challenging investigations I've dealt with.
Cressida Dick is appointed as the new Metropolitan Police Commissioner, becoming the first woman in its 188-year history to run Scotland Yard. The appointment's been criticised by the family of John Charles de Menezes, the innocent man who was shot dead after the London bombings. A jury later found that Ms Dick, who was in charge on the day, had done nothing wrong. The brother of the British IS fighter who carried out a suicide bombing in Iraq describes how his family tried to prevent him from going to Syria.
Or even his wife tried to stop him, going over there, and went over herself and got in trouble too. It's been hard for us,
The Supreme Court says income rules which prevent some people bringing a foreign spouse to the UK are lawful. Also coming up, the BBC is to launch a new television channel in Scotland. It'll broadcast from autumn next year with an annual £30 million budget. And Diana's fashion story, a new exhibition traces how her style evolved. Good afternoon and welcome to BBC News. The fiancé of the children's author Helen Bailey has been found guilty of murdering her and dumping her body in a cesspit under their home in Hertfordshire. Ian Stewart, who's 56, drugged Miss Bailey over several months before smothering her in April last year in the hope of claiming a multi-million-pound inheritance. Detectives are now re-examining the death of Stewart's previous partner, his wife Diane, who died suddenly in 2010. Let's go to our correspondent Ben Ando, who's at St Albans Crown Court for us. Ben.
Yes, it's been a 7-week trial. It took the jury 6 hours to decide that Ian Stewart was guilty of murder, guilty of fraud, guilty of preventing a lawful burial and guilty of 3 counts of perverting the course of justice. As the jury foreman gave the verdict, Stewart shook his head and blinked. In the public gallery, Helen Bailey's brother John nodded slowly. The evidence against Stewart was almost overwhelming, as my colleague June Kelly now reports.
Police recorded Ian Stewart's arrest at his home.
I'm arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Helen Bailey. You're joking?
He was stunned he'd finally been caught out. For 3 months he'd been living with the body of his wealthy partner buried under the garage.
Why? I don't understand.
My name's Helen Bailey and I'd like to introduce you to my new book, which is called When Bad Things Happen in Good Bikinis.
Helen Bailey was a successful author. As well as murdering her, Stewart also killed her dachshund Boris, whom she doted on.
Oh, that wasn't supposed to happen.
After her husband's death, Helen Bailey began blogging about her sense of loss. And it was through a Facebook bereavement group that she met Ian Stewart, whose wife had died. She thought she'd found a new soulmate. But while she was planning their wedding, he was planning her murder. Last spring, Helen Bailey suddenly vanished from their £1 million home in Royston in Hertfordshire. It took Ian Stewart 5 days to report her missing.
Hertfordshire Police, how can I help?
Hello there. My partner has been missing since Monday and not contacted anyone.
Despite appeals from family and friends, there was no sign of Helen Bailey. 3 months after she disappeared, police came back here and began searching places they hadn't looked at before, including a spot in the garage. The garage was at a distance from the house. This laser imaging illustrates how underneath a hatch door there was a well with a cesspit. The police started probing, and it was here, below a layer of sewage, that they saw an arm. They had found Helen Bailey's body, and buried with her was her dog, Boris. There was even a possibility that because she'd been drugged, she could have been alive when Stewart put her down here. CCTV shows how within hours Ian Stewart drove to a rubbish tip to dump a duvet.
Was that duvet taken to the tip because it had Helen's blood on it?
In police interviews, Stewart said nothing. He probably smothered Helen Bailey after drugging her over a long period with his sleeping pills. His motive was money. He was set to benefit massively from her £4 million fortune.
If Helen had written a book of the story, you wouldn't believe it. He'd probably planned it all from the day he met her. And in hindsight, I don't think he loved her at all. But Helen definitely loved him.
This is Ian Stewart's late wife, Diane. With his criminal trial over, we can now report that the police are re-examining her sudden death, said to have been caused by an epileptic fit. At this stage, there's no indication of anything suspicious.
Well, I think it's only right that I consider what might have happened in Ian Stewart's past, to see whether there's anything that I need to get involved in, whether there's any fresh evidence that might have come out from this trial.
After his wife died, Ian Stewart was seen with other women before he began his predatory pursuit of Helen Bailey. As a writer, she was used to studying human behaviour, but she never learned the true character of the man who was closest to her and who she thought she knew best.
The judge will sentence Ian Stewart here at St Albans tomorrow. Having been convicted of murder, the sentence will be automatically one of life imprisonment, but it will be up to the judge exactly how long is the minimum amount of time that Stewart must serve before he can even be considered for parole. Back to you.
Ben Ando at St Albans Crown Court, thank you very much. Just to bring you some breaking news coming in from Northern Ireland, we're just hearing that police say a bomb exploded outside the home of a serving police officer in Londonderry this morning as Army technical officers were actually trying to defuse it. The device was discovered under a car at Ardenlea in the Culmore area of the city. The area was cordoned off. A number of homes were evacuated in the ongoing security alert. Now, Northern Ireland's Policing Board Vice Chair Debbie Waters has said that the officer had a very lucky escape. But such activity reinforces the continuing threat that exists for our police officers both on and off duty. We'll have more on that a little later on. Cressida Dick has been named as the new head of Scotland Yard, becoming the first woman to hold the post at the most senior post in British policing. The 56-year-old will succeed Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe as Metropolitan Police Commissioner. Ms Dick will return to the force after leaving for the Foreign Office 2 years ago. However, her selection is not without controversy. In 2005, she was the commander responsible for the anti-terrorism operation that led to the death of an innocent man, John Charles de Menezes, at an underground station in South London. Well, the new commissioner has just released a statement. She says, "I'm thrilled and humbled. This is a great responsibility and an amazing opportunity," she says. "I'm looking forward immensely to protecting and serving the people of London and working again with the fabulous women and men of the Met. Thank you so much to everyone who's taught me and supported me along the way." Well, the de Menezes family have also released a statement with their reaction to the appointment. The family lawyer says, "We have serious concerns about the appointment of Cressida Dick. The Commissioner and those in operational command should have been held responsible. It is shameful that this role is filled by someone who is tainted by the killing of an innocent man and the subsequent attempted cover-up." Let's go to our Home Affairs correspondent, Tom Simons, who's outside New Scotland Yard. She has quite an inbox.
She does, and I think she will have to put behind her that incident in 2005 right from the start, because as you can see from that statement from the family of Jean-Charles de Menezes, that there is still hurt there. She was the commander in charge of that operation. The log that was kept of what was happening in the command room at the time sets out that she asked officers on the ground to stop Jean-Charles de Menezes. She says, "I did not ask them to shoot him," and a trial of the Metropolitan Police on health and safety charges later found that she had done nothing wrong on that day, the jury specifically making that point. So she will have to put that behind her and get on with the day job of running this huge police force, 43,000 officers, a budget of £3 billion, and of course a budget which is stretched to say the least. Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe, who she takes over from, has said he is concerned that he will be that whoever was going to take over was going to face pressure to keep numbers of police officers up, and he said that he was already seeing warning signs from an increase in violent crime, in knife crime in London. So there is an awful lot for her to do. So Bernard Hogan-Howe's advice to her was get a holiday. You're going to be working very hard.
Tom, thank you very much. Tom Simons there at New Scotland Yard. The brother of a British suicide bomber has condemned his actions. Leon Jameson said the family had tried to persuade him to return home from Syria. At the weekend, Ronald Fiddler carried out a suicide bombing in Iraq after joining the so-called Islamic State. A former independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, Lord Carlisle, has said Mr Fiddler should never have been paid £1 million in compensation. The former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, has hit out at press reports criticising his role in the matter, saying the compensation was agreed by a Conservative-led administration. Well, with me now is our security correspondent, Frank Gardner. The mud is being slung. There is potentially a lot of damage here, isn't there?
Yeah, I think this is quite embarrassing for both governments, both Tony Blair's government and for the 2010 coalition government, because either way, taxpayers' money was paid to somebody who turned out to be a terrorist. Was he a terrorist at the time? No, probably not. He'd been in Guantanamo Bay.
We don't know, though, do we?
Well, in 2004, he'd been cleared. All the charges against him were dropped. He'd come out of 2 years in Guantanamo Bay, where, along with other people, he'd suffered abuses. And I'm not in any way defending him, but at the time, there was nothing to connect him with violent crime. And for the next 10 years, there was nothing to connect him with violent extremism. So when people come out of Guantanamo Bay, or if they come back from Syria, they are assessed as to whether they are a threat to Britain and to the British population. and they are placed under some kind of monitoring. If the automatic suspicion in the case of Syria is that they will have seen and possibly done some very violent things, so they are under a good deal of surveillance. In his case, he hadn't shown his hand. And remember that 1 year after he came back from Guantanamo Bay, we had 7/7, we had the London bombings. So there were much bigger fish to fry. It was an intelligence failing, there's no question about it. But what they've got to do is manage their resources. They've got to prioritise. They've got, by them, I mean the police and MI5, they can't watch everybody all the time. They've got to divert their resources to where the threat is considered to be most serious and most dangerous. And he was not considered to be a serious threat. What we don't know is what the state of his mind was between 2004 and 2014. You know, if he was a serious hardcore radical, he waited a lot of time before he went back to violent activity. My feeling is that he probably wasn't a violent person for most of that time, but then he decided towards the end, around 2013, 2014, with ISIS on the ascendant, probably thought, I'll have a piece of this, went to Turkey, crossed the border, said, I don't know much about Islam, but I want to be a fighter.
Quite a lot of lessons to have been learned, and the hope is that they have been, because there are those that could be coming back from Syria and Iraq quite soon of a similar mind.
I think it's a real reminder to the government that they need to try and get this right. You know, they can't see inside people's minds, but they've got to absolutely get this system of triage right in judging whether somebody is a security risk or not. And some people who've come back, who are former jihadis, are very clever at pretending they put it all behind them. It's happened with people who've come from Guantanamo Bay and gone to Saudi Arabia, who are Saudi citizens, who've convinced the Saudi authorities, who are pretty expert at this, no, all of that's behind them. I just want to lead a normal life. And then they cross the border to Yemen and join Al-Qaeda.
And underlining the difficulty, of course, is, Fidler's brother has been talking to the BBC about this.
He has, yes. This is Leon Fidler, whose brother, a little bit older than him, 3 years older, and he gave, I think, quite a sort of emotional interview where he talked about, he mentioned what a wasted life his brother had had, and he talked about what he could have been. Let's have a listen.
It shocked me as well as woke me up, you know, to what can happen when you join the wrong, you know, when you do the wrong things.
What would you say to any other families who see this sort of thing happening to someone?
Just keep a good lookout on people, check up now and then, not too, you know, obvious or, you know, but if you disturb someone like that, they will, you know, they will go the way they want to go, which is towards the other side, you see.
So that's the brother there, Leon Fidler, the brother of the British jihadist who's blown himself up outside Mosul. He was a Muslim convert. He started the life, his parents were of Jamaican origin, started his life as Ronald Fidler and changed his name to Jamal Harith, and then was given a kind of nom de guerre by ISIS, by a so-called Islamic State. Often extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS will prey on Muslim converts because they know they don't have a profound knowledge of Islam. They haven't had that devout upbringing that many Muslim families will have brought their children up with a respect for others, of piety, of fasting during Ramadan, etc., and of, you know, all the good things that Islam can teach people is often not there with Muslim converts, especially if they've converted in prison. Not in his case, but it's especially prison converts who are then very much exposed to a violent interpretation of it, and they go straight off and get taken up as fighters and suicide bombers.
Frank, thank you very much. Frank Gardner there. Well, Tony Blair, who was Prime Minister at the time of Fidler's release, has given a statement. He says Jamal al-Harith was released from Guantanamo Bay at the request of the British government in 2004. This followed a parliamentary and massive media campaign led by the Daily Mail, the very paper he says that is now supposedly so outraged at his release. The fact is that this was always a very difficult situation where any government would have to balance proper concern for civil liberties with the desire to protect our security, and we were likely to be attacked whatever course we took. Well, let's speak to Raffaello Pantucci, who's Director of International Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institution think tank. Picking up on what Frank said, I mean, it's very difficult to pick up what's in people's minds once they've been through an experience like Guantanamo Bay.
Well, I mean, exactly. And then I think his case was always a curious one because, well, he had certainly, it's certainly questionable what he was doing in Pakistan and near the Afghan border at exactly that moment in time. It's not always clear that he was really part of a sort of radical community. And it's not very clear at which point he really started going very much down that path. But what we do know is he spent some time in Guantanamo Bay, and they came out of Guantanamo Bay, and it took 10 years for him to end up making the decision that we saw him making over the weekend. And during that sort of arc of a 20-year period almost, it's very difficult to pin down exactly the moment at which you could sort of identify him as a specific individual who would end up conducting this sort of activity.
And again, as Frank said, this was an awfully long period between him apparently not being radicalised to then deciding to do something about it.
Well, I think that if we look at the period from when he returned to the United Kingdom from Guantanamo Bay, he was certainly circulating in a milieu where there were other radicalized individuals. Now, that doesn't necessarily condemn him by guilt by association, but he was certainly in a milieu where you had people who had been radicalized, and by that point he would have been exposed to some of these ideas. But exactly the moment at which a sort of trigger gets switched, it's very difficult to tell. I mean, this is a man who, during this 10-year period between when he sort of returned to the United Kingdom and then went off to Syria and Iraq, married, had a number of children, and this was not his first marriage or his first set of children. And yet, even from having done that, established a sort of relatively normal family life, still decided to make this choice.
So what happened? Did complacency set in? Someone took their eye off the ball?
Well, I think the issue becomes, we sort of, as I think Frank very correctly pointed out, if he returned in 2004, that was when police and security agencies here were disrupting their first sort of major plot of sort of terrorists with some loose connection to Pakistan trying to launch an attack here in the form of the Crevice plot to attack the Blue Water shopping centre with a large bomb. A year later, you had the 7/7 bombers and then the 21/7 bombers. A year after that, you had the airlines plot to bring down up to 8 airlines on transatlantic routes with liquid bombs. You had a period where the authorities were looking at a sort of threat picture where they were seeing sort of immediate large-scale threats being directed by Al-Qaeda core at the United Kingdom and British interests. So their attention was very much on that community rather than a sort of potentially peripheral individual like this whose direct allegiances and links to these groups is never entirely clear, who then returned to the United Kingdom and had sort of taken quite a high profile role, but again didn't have a history of violence, so he didn't necessarily fit as to one of the ones who they would prioritize. At the end of the day, their security agencies, police have limited resources and they have to prioritize who they will focus their attention on. And it's not correct, it would be incorrect for them to focus necessarily on someone who wasn't really becoming involved in the sort of immediate threat activity that they were seeing before them.
Raffaello, thank you very much. Raffaello Pantucci, thank you for your time. The headlines here on BBC News, it's come up to 20 minutes past 4. The fiancé of the children's author Helen Bailey is found guilty of murder. He drugged and suffocated her before throwing her body into a cesspit. Cressida Dick is appointed as the new Metropolitan Police Commissioner, becoming the first woman to run Scotland Yard. The brother of a British IS fighter who carried out a suicide bombing in Iraq says his family couldn't change his mind about going to Syria.
And in sport, Manchester United take a 3-0 lead to St Etienne in their Europa League tie this evening, amid reports that captain Wayne Rooney could be considering a move to China. Later tonight, Leicester City face Seville in their first leg of their last 16 Champions League tie. Their boss Claudio Ranieri says a win could be a turning point in their season. They currently sit 17th in the Premier League. And George North will start for Wales in their Six Nations match with Scotland on Saturday after recovering from a thigh injury. I'll be back with more on those stories just after past.
The Supreme Court has upheld a controversial rule preventing British citizens on below-average incomes from bringing their foreign husbands or wives into the country from outside Europe. Judges rejected an appeal by families who argued the threshold of more than £18,000 a year breached their human rights. The court decided the rule was lawful, but criticised it as defective because it didn't prioritise the welfare of children. Daniel Sanford reports.
They look like any other family. But Caroline Coombs, her husband Carlos from Ecuador, and their 15-month-old son Thomas live in a permanent state of uncertainty, not knowing whether they'll be able to stay together in Britain, because Caroline, a former television producer, is earning less than £18,000 a year, which under new immigration rules is not enough to bring a foreign husband or wife to the UK.
We were two very capable human beings who happened to fall in love. And we were being told that we'd be split up. And we had a young baby. And it was like we weren't being given the right to be a family in my own country.
The Supreme Court ruling today said that the new rules were defective, particularly when it came to children, but it found that the controversial MIR, the minimum income requirement, did not break human rights laws.
It holds that the MIR is acceptable in principle, but the rules and instructions fail to take proper account of the Section 55 duty in respect of children.
Although the government has technically lost this case in the Supreme Court on the way it implements its new rule, it is nonetheless a victory for ministers on the principle that people on low incomes can't just assume that their foreign husband or wife can automatically join them in Britain.
It is considered reasonable to expect you to leave the UK and...
But Caroline and Carlos do now have a chance because the Home Office agreed today to carefully consider what the Supreme Court had said about how the rules are unlawful because they don't pay enough attention to the best interests of children.
The system is wrong. Something needs to be changed. And not only for me, for all the other kids that are out there, for all the other moms that are suffering every day. Can I sleep thinking that the husband has